When a Genestealer Cult discovers special growth stims, they decided to experiment on their Neophyte hybrids, and noticed something strange. Rather than simply giving them bigger muscles and making them taller, it gave them uncontrolled mutations, and many did not survive this process, but those that did gained immense power. The idea for this project began when I noticed this box at my local store. I looked over the sprue and noticed all of the mining equipment, which instantly got me thinking of the Genestealer Cult. So I opened up the instructions manual and assembled my first Goliath. The most notable feature of their armor were these very large spikes, so that was the first thing that I removed. To ensure these panels had a very nice smooth surface, I did sand them down with a bit of sandpaper. The process was surprisingly time consuming, but I think it was well worth it. I looked through some of my Genestealer bits before landing on this very nice looking claw. Due to the monopose nature of these arms, I chose to cut it off at the wrist. This way I can preserve the already monstrous muscle anatomy while still giving it that Genestealer trait. Even with my initial doubts about matching the parts together, the moment I saw the arm and the body, it appeared as if it had always been there. To smooth out the transition even more, I used a bit of sprue glue, which would be quite vital to the rest of the project. I looked back into my pile of bits to see if I can find any more parts that I associate with Genestealers, which led me to this box that they often have on the front of their suits. Removing such a small piece and attaching it to the armor was a lot more challenging than I anticipated, however I still wanted it to go there. Even with the small imperfections, it was well worth it. For the next piece, I decided on the shoulder-mounted flashlights. Fortunately here, all I had to do was simply remove it and then just place it on the shoulder pad, which was an incredibly pleasant change of pace after having to spend over 5 minutes trying to scrape that box together. For the head, I chose to go with a very simple one from the Neophyte hybrids, then removed some of the parts that were getting in the way to accommodate these changes. Given the hulking presence of this absolute monstrosity, I thought it'd be a very good proxy for the Abominant. Because of that, for his weapon, I gave him this very interesting looking hammer from the Necromunda squad set. I also found some interesting grenade launcher rounds that reminded me a lot of the chem suit he has, hinting at the fact that he constantly has to replenish the chem supply to maintain his size. Inspired by the Abominant, I thought giving him an extra arm would be a very cool idea. Not to mention, having extra arms just always looks really cool in Genestealers. I picked out one of the open-looking arms and cut it into place before trying my best to squeeze it into the area connecting to the muscle. Because of the way I chose to attach these two parts together, they were under considerable amounts of pressure. So before this spring-loaded arm lunged away, I used as much of the thin cement as I could to melt the two parts together. Then used a very generous amount of sprue glue to not only visually connect the two parts together, but make sure that it never accidentally launches off that arm. Attaching an arm at a tricep is a little bit weird, however Genestealers are known for their very freaky anatomy, where their limbs are just growing out of wherever possible. One thing I really wanted to do for a while to one of my Genestealers is to give him a tail. However, up to this point I couldn't exactly find the right miniature where the tail would serve a purpose. Yet for this enormous walking muscle, I think it'll provide some additional value by helping him balance during combat. Being able to swing that massive tail counter to what he's using on his swings, he can shift his center of balance, making him even more deadly. And to give you an idea just how massive this guy is, here he is next to normal Aberrant. The next page of the manual described how to build a female Goliath. While assembling her, I didn't have a specific idea in mind of what kind of mutations I want to give her. So similar to the big fellow, I decided to leave off her arms and just focus on removing some of those extra spikes. I looked through a collection of all of my heads and I noticed that I don't have any female Genestealer heads. However, with their heads being very bald, I didn't think it'd be noticeable, so I just chose the one with a face mask. When I destroyed the Hormagaunt to extract the tail, I was left with a very interesting torso, so I want to attach some of the chitin to her back. Having a massive Tyranid spinal cord is not just going to make her stronger, but it's also going to make her faster, and give her better nerve conduction so she can have lightning fast response times. And with all of that in mind, I thought she could make a very interesting assassin character. I tried to find a weapon that would match an assassin, which landed me on the Scything Talons. However, instead of using this Genestealer one, I thought it'd be a lot more interesting if she had one from a proper Tyranid. Perhaps similar to her Hormagaunt, she also has a toxic sac located somewhere underneath that chitin, making her even deadlier. The connection for the arm wasn't perfect, so I did use a very generous amount of sprue glue. For the second arm, I actually found this very interesting muscular arm from one of the Necromunda sets, but I replaced the weapon with a Genestealer hammer. When attaching the arm, I thought it was a perfect flush fit from the front, however, when I looked at the miniature from the back, it turned out there was an enormous gap left once again. so I flooded the area with sprue goo to hopefully fill it in. I considered giving her a third arm, however I thought she was already looking very Tyranid enough. So I moved on to the final member of this team. Looking over his assembly, I thought he'd make a very interesting Demolition Expert. So I picked out a head to facilitate all of that big brain explosive knowledge. He did have two options for his weapons, a welder and this massive rock saw, which had a certain insane bank robber look to it that matched the personality I envisioned for him. However, even with this massive rock saw, he just did not look insane enough. So I found this Genestealer claw holding a massive stick of dynamite. I really wanted to attach both of the arms onto it, however, it was quite clear that his shoulder socket was simply not big enough. I tried cutting off some extra area to see if I could fit it in there a little bit better. But unfortunately, we were gonna need to lose an arm. With this terrible loss out of the way, I did however gain an opportunity to pose this arm in a much more interesting way. Something else that screamed a lack of safety in mind is strapping two massive tanks of Promethium to his back. Because when you're walking around with a massive stick of dynamite, what's a bit of extra Promethium between friends? In case that doesn't do the job, there's some more grenades here as well. Because I really couldn't help myself, I did give him a tiny little claw. With that, the Demolition Expert and the insane member of the team was finished. When it actually came to painting them, I thought about for a while if I should paint them like my Genestealers, however, I thought given their very crazy and just weird look, I should probably paint them like my Space Marine Genestealers. Maybe one day somehow combine them together into some sort of weird army, so that's the color scheme I'm gonna go for. For the initial skin tone, I mixed a bit of Bugman Glow with some purple paint. I then slowly began to build up to the Bugman Glow on its own to create the idea of this very alien looking skin. To highlight all of my muscles, I slowly added a bit of ice yellow to my color. I wanted to first sketch out all of the highlights of the muscles before I got to painting any of the mutations. This way, I should hopefully have a much easier time when creating the transitions between them. To give each of the muscle a very three-dimensional looking effect, especially when it's very far away in the tabletop, I made sure to provide a lot of highlights. But at the same time, leave a little bit of the previous layer visible to make them blend together. And a Genestealer painted in this pale skin tone was incredibly uncomfortable looking. So I took out a little bit of the purple paint and mixed it in with a very large amount of water. I want to slowly glaze all of this purple between the transition of where the Tyranid and the human meets, focusing a lot more purple on the back of the model. I really want to create this idea that this horrible Tyranid mutation is primarily coming from the back, to the point that if you ignore the massive size of all of his muscles, you would even think that he's just a normal human. Yet to anyone close enough, and especially anyone behind him, there'd be absolutely no doubt that he's a Tyranid monstrosity. When it came to painting his jeans, I used a little bit of rubber black and mixed a tiny amount of blue in there. I thought for some time about which color the stims should be, and I landed on a very bright red. Given that model was primed in a near white color, I used some contrast paints to make this process just a little bit easier for myself. I did decide to essentially batch paint him, so every single time I'm doing a step on one model, I'm repeating it on the rest of them too. Contrast paint was being incredibly effective in this process, so I also used it for the leather straps. For a while, I did consider using some metallic paints to paint his shoes. However, I did end up landing on a rubber black because I just thought it gave it a much more of a space look to it. I did compare this miniature to my Space Marine Genestealers, and I noticed that my carapace has a lot more blue hues to it. So I added several of these blue tinted highlights to the carapace and some of the Tyranid arms. All of the purple glazing I was doing did remove some of the brightness from the skin tone, so I took out some of the pure ice yellow and did some more final highlights. I was quite satisfied with the skin tone, but I was particularly surprised by how cool the Tyranid mutations look. Then to make my life a little bit easier, I took a little bit of speed paint, mixed it up into a very nice wash, and applied it all over the armor panels. The effect I'm trying to achieve here is to not just create the normal shadows that the wash usually gives you, but those are going to be really helpful, but it's to additionally create some additional staining on the armor so that it matches much more faithfully to the rest of my Space Marine Genestealers. I did use a very small amount of wash on some of the Tyranid chitin areas that I thought were a little bit flat and could just use a few more extra shadows. Once the wash was finally dry, I did first actually varnish the miniature before applying any of the paint. This is primarily because of the flow improver I used in the wash. It does make the model a little bit glossy. As for the highlights of the armor, I went for something very similar to what I did on my Genestealer Dreadnought. which is to go for a mixture between some edge highlighting as well as these scratch marks to just provide a lot more interesting texture to the otherwise flat armor panels. Originally, I thought about leaving the red as it was, but it did look a little bit flat compared to the excessive highlights I had in the rest of the model. So I began highlighting the red, going for a very bright saturated color, and then slowly adding in just a little bit of white to create some concentrated highlights. Then I got to the favorite part of my color scheme, which is to paint this very bright blue-green color for the weapons as well as all of the claws. On my Genestealer Dreadnought as well as the Space Marines, I was able to use an airbrush to make my life a little bit easier. However, in this situation, because all of the parts were so close together, I did not have that option. For the claws, it did mean they didn't turn out as well as I wanted to. However, for the hammer, it had the complete opposite effect. Because I was able to control my highlights and go for a much more specialized and edge highlighted look, I was able to create an idea of a very reflective surface that also reminded me of this very beautiful gemstone. I also found a very interesting trick to hide the essentially flawed edge highlighting I was doing to the weapon by providing some additional scratches around the area where the edge was highlighted. Originally, when painting the mining flashlights, I thought I would go for a very bright and saturated yellow. However, I opted on to go for this very lime-looking green, as I thought it would offer a much more interesting contrast between the technically green of the claws and the green of the flashlight. I actually entirely forgot that there was a second tube on this miniature, so I ended up painting it in a purple hue just to showcase that perhaps it's just the Tyranid fluids inside of it. And for the final step and the last highlight, I just did some additional highlights for the rubber black. And just like that, the Heroes of Ascension were complete. And on that bombshell, let's see the final result. Now, I did paint the familiar and I included him in the base originally, however, it just really wasn't vibing with the rest of the theme, so I ended up removing him. Maybe one day I'll change my mind and placing him back there. It's still an option, but for now, it's just gonna be without it. Thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed this. Consider watching this video, maybe this one of them. I'll see you next time.